They claim they engineered a 1.2-mile underwater tunnel specifically for coal-burning steam trains. So why did it instantly become a lethal gas chamber? Steam engines require massive amounts of oxygen, but the Mersey Tunnel physically contradicts the basic laws of thermodynamics. Mainstream history asks you to accept a very sanitized, triumphant narrative. They claim that in 1886, men with hand tools conquered solid sandstone directly beneath millions of tons of crushing river water. And official records proudly declare they lined this subterranean artery with exactly 38 million bricks in record time. It is a perfect story of the British Industrial Revolution and a complete logistical impossibility. Lethal hydrostatic pressure, chemical curing limits of underwater mortar ignored, and a catastrophic airflow anomaly proving this massive structure was never built for steam. The illusion of Victorian supremacy ends now. You are watching a Titan Metrics forensic audit. The file is unlocked. To understand the physical paradox of the Mersey Tunnel, we must first audit its primary operational function. The official historical ledger claims that the greatest engineering minds of the British Empire, men who calculated the exact tensile limits of wrought iron bridges and the hydrostatic pressures of deep-sea cables, designed and excavated this deep underwater tube exclusively for standard coal-burning steam locomotives. Let us run the basic chemistry of combustion. A steam locomotive pulling a heavy passenger train up the steep 1 in 27 gradients of the Mersey Tunnel burned hundreds of pounds of coal per trip. When you burn coal in a confined, oxygen-deprived space, it results in incomplete combustion. This chemical reaction produces massive, lethal volumes of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. Carbon monoxide is a silent, invisible killer. It is lethal to human biology at concentrations as low as 1,200 parts per million in just 30 minutes. The engineers built a perfectly sealed tube, 1.2 miles long, directly under a tidal river, with absolutely no natural airflow. And then they drove smoking, fire-breathing leviathans through it. Within weeks of operation, the tunnel became a toxic death trap. The air was so violently choked with sulfur and carbon smoke that drivers could not see the signals. Passengers were physically asphyxiated in the carriages, coughing up thick black soot. It is the physical equivalent of running a heavy-duty diesel generator inside a locked, unventilated bank vault and expecting the people inside to survive. The rudimentary steam-driven ventilation fans they frantically scrambled to install were woefully inadequate against the sheer volumetric exhaust. The multi-million-pound infrastructure was effectively a failure from day one, forcing the railway into extreme financial distress before it was electrified in 1903. Are we expected to believe that elite Victorian engineers simply forgot that steam trains produce smoke? Did they spend millions excavating a tube without calculating the volumetric airflow required to keep their paying customers alive? Gross incompetence of this magnitude at the highest levels of imperial engineering is statistically less probable than a deliberate cover-up. The physical evidence dictates that this tunnel was never originally designed for steam locomotives.
If the operational design contradicts logic, the construction timeline contradicts physics. Let us audit the raw excavation process. The main tunnel required an internal width of 26 feet and a height of 21 feet to accommodate double railway tracks. But to place the multi-layered brick lining, the raw excavation had to be significantly larger, approximately 30 feet in diameter. Using standard volumetric calculations for a cylinder over the 1.2-mile underwater stretch, the raw geometric void is over 4.4 million cubic feet. When we account for the required drainage headings and the steep approach tunnels on the Liverpool and Birkenhead sides, The total volume exceeds 6 million cubic feet of solid rock. Bunter sandstone weighs roughly 140 pounds per cubic foot. When heavily saturated with river water, that weight increases drastically. We are looking at the extraction, vertical lifting, and disposal of over 420,000 tons of wet, heavy rock. Before we even analyze the removal of that stone, let us audit the biological environment of the workforce. The miners are operating 100 feet below the riverbed in absolute pitch-black darkness. Before modern electrical lighting was viable for this highly wet, dangerous environment, the excavation relied entirely on open flame illumination. Thousands of oil lamps, tallow candles, and primitive gas flares burning simultaneously inside a sealed underground tube.
Fire consumes massive amounts of oxygen. In a tightly confined space packed with hundreds of sweating men, horses pulling carts, and the constant hiss of subterranean steam pumps, the oxygen depletion rate would be catastrophic. The black carbon soot alone would densely coat the lungs of every worker. The air would become a toxic, suffocating sludge long before the first passenger train ever entered the tunnel. Yet the official timeline completely ignores the basic thermodynamics of human respiration. The official ledger claims this massive excavation was achieved primarily by men swinging handpicks, using black powder explosives, and loading horse-drawn carts. Stop and audit the chemistry of that claim. Black powder. The Mersey Void was a hydrological nightmare, flooded by millions of gallons of water. The walls were constantly weeping. The floor was a literal river. Black powder is extremely hygroscopic. It aggressively absorbs moisture from the air. In a highly saturated, dripping underwater tunnel, standard 1880s black powder instantly becomes a wet, useless sludge. It physically does not detonate. Even if we concede that they utilized expensive, pitch-sealed, waterproof charges, the sheer volume of toxic sulfur smoke from the massive detonations would have instantly compounded the oxygen deficit. Mainstream historians love to point to the Beaumont compressed air boring machine as the technological savior of this project. They claim this early prototype tunneled through the rock, powered by air compressors on the surface. But let us run the pneumatic physics. To force compressed air down a 170-foot shaft and push it horizontally for half a mile requires massive, heavily sealed cast iron pipes. In 1880, maintaining that level of pneumatic pressure over that distance without fatal pressure drops or pipe ruptures was a monumental task. But the true failure is at the cutting face. A rotary boring machine grinding into saturated, weeping bunter sandstone doesn't just cut rock, it creates a thick, highly viscous, abrasive paste. It is the physical equivalent of liquid sandpaper. This wet, heavy sludge would aggressively bind the primitive iron gears and rapidly dull the cutting heads of a Victorian machine within hours. The Beaumont machine was a mechanical novelty used for pilot headings, not the primary workhorse of a 6 million cubic foot excavation. But the ultimate logistical bottleneck remains the vertical extraction. How do you remove 420,000 tons of wet rock through narrow 15-foot vertical drainage shafts using 1880s steam hoists? To meet the official timeline of roughly 5 years of active tunneling, they would have needed to extract, hoist, and cart away over 230 tons of rock every single day, 365 days a year. It is a logistical traffic jam that mathematically collapses in on itself. But the rock extraction is only a fraction of the physical impossibility. Once the void was opened, the Victorian engineers faced their true enemy, the water. The Mersey Tunnel was not bored through solid, impermeable granite. It was driven through porous, fractured bunter sandstone directly beneath a massive tidal estuary. The hydrostatic pressure acting upon the tunnel roof was immense. Water didn't just passively leak into this workspace, it blasted through the geological fissures at catastrophic rates. According to the official historical accounts, the engineers had to install massive steam-driven pumping engines just to keep the newly dug void from becoming a permanent underwater tomb. The official records proudly state these pumps were extracting up to 10,000 gallons of water every single minute. Let's pause the narrative and audit that specific thermodynamic claim. 10,000 gallons per minute equates to 600,000 gallons an hour. That is over 14.4 million gallons of freezing river water crashing into the tunnel every 24 hours. To lift 14 million gallons of water vertically up a 170-foot drainage shaft requires a staggering, unbroken chain of kinetic energy. Victorian steam pumps, specifically the massive Cornish beam engines used at the Hamilton Square pumping stations, were robust but inherently inefficient by modern thermodynamic standards. To maintain a constant extraction rate of 14 million gallons a day, the massive iron boilers powering these pumps would require a non-stop apocalyptic supply of coal. We are talking about burning dozens of tons of coal per day, every single day, for years.
This creates an entirely secondary, high-risk logistical supply chain on the surface. While hundreds of tons of wet rock are supposedly being hauled up the narrow shafts from below, thousands of tons of coal must simultaneously be hauled by horse-drawn wagons through the muddy city streets to the pumping stations. If the coal supply stops for even 12 hours, if a single iron gear fractures, if a boiler loses pressure, the pumps stop and the tunnel entirely floods, drowning every man inside and destroying years of progress. But the thermodynamic battle of the coal is only half the problem. Let us audit the geotechnical reality of moving that much water. In fluid dynamics, when you extract 14 million gallons of water from a localized subterranean point, you create what is known as a cone of depression. You are creating a massive, unnatural low-pressure void directly beneath the weight of a tidal river. The Mersey riverbed is not solid steel. It is composed of thousands of tons of loose silt, sand, and gravel resting on top of the porous sandstone. When the steam pumps suck the water out of the rock, the immense gravitational weight of the river above actively pushes that loose silt down into the fissures, trying to fill the void. This phenomenon is called piping, and it leads to catastrophic subsidence. The structural integrity of the sandstone roof would be fatally compromised. The riverbed should have violently caved in, crushing the tunnel and the workers beneath millions of tons of mud and water. Yet the official narrative claims the riverbed remained mathematically stable despite the extraction of billions of gallons of supporting water over 5 years. It is a geotechnical paradox.
The math of the physical space completely shatters when we introduce the final element of this logistical triad: sealing the flooded void. To hold back the crushing weight of the river and seal the porous rock, the Mersey Tunnel was lined with heavy brickwork. Not just a single layer, but up to 6 rings of solid brick bonded with hydraulic cement. The universally accepted historical figure is that 38 million bricks were used to line the tunnel. At Titan Metrics, we do not just accept large numbers, we break them down into physical mass and time. A standard Victorian brick weighs roughly 5 pounds. 38 million bricks weigh exactly 95,000 tons. 95,000 tons. To move that sheer mass today, you would need a continuous, unbroken convoy of over 2,000 modern, heavy-duty, 18-wheeler semi-trucks. The official ledger claims they moved this mass with wooden carts and horses funneled into a freezing, flooded tunnel. Let us audit the subterranean assembly. To lay 38 million bricks within the official timeline of the lining phase, bricklayers would have to place roughly 30,000 bricks every single day. Keep in mind the severe environmental reality of this workspace. This is a dark, freezing, deafeningly loud tube 100 feet below a riverbed
with pressurized water violently pouring in from the ceiling and walls. And we must audit the chemistry of the mortar itself. To bind 38 million bricks, you need thousands of tons of dry Portland cement powder and clean sand. Transporting dry cement down a dripping, flooded vertical shaft is a logistical nightmare. The ambient humidity alone would cause the powder to harden in the bags before it ever reached the bricklayers.
Once underground, the cement must be mixed. If the contractors use the highly brackish, salty estuary water blasting through the walls, the chemical reaction is doomed. Salt water introduces chlorides and sulfates that aggressively attack early Portland cement, preventing it from properly curing and causing it to crumble under pressure. They would have to transport thousands of gallons of pure, fresh surface water down into the flooded tunnel just to mix the mortar. And then consider the geometric scaffolding. To build a 30-foot diameter brick arch, you must construct massive, heavy wooden semicircular frames called centering. These frames hold the bricks against gravity until the mortar chemically sets. How do you maneuver massive, fully assembled 30-foot wooden arches down a narrow 15-foot vertical drainage shaft? You can't. They had to be disassembled, lowered piece by piece, and meticulously rebuilt in the pitch-black, freezing, flooded tunnel, moving them forward inch by inch as the brickwork advanced. This physical assembly and disassembly creates an absolute, unbreakable speed limit on the construction. The physics of curing mortar create a hard limit on how fast a tunnel can be lined. Yet the official timeline completely ignores this chemical reality, compressing the bricklaying phase into a window that violates the material limits of the era. We have 3 impossible logistics occurring in the exact same narrow tube simultaneously: the vertical extraction of hundreds of thousands of tons of wet rock, the thermodynamic battle against 14 million gallons of water a day, and the precise, chemically constrained installation of 95,000 tons of brickwork. Any independent forensic engineer will look at this ledger and tell you one thing: the official timeline is a fabricated cover story. History asks us to accept the sanitized ledger, but physics does not accept propaganda. When the official timeline is mathematically impossible, we must look at the structural reality left behind. If the excavation timeline violates the limits of manual labor, if the logistics of the brickwork violate the laws of spatial chemistry, and if the final operational design completely ignores the lethal reality of coal smoke, we are left with only one mechanically sound hypothesis: the found structure theory. What if the Victorian engineers of the 1880s did not dig the Mersey Void? What if they merely discovered it? If a pre-existing, older subterranean infrastructure, perhaps an ancient drainage system, a legacy aqueduct, or a pneumatic transit tube from a forgotten era of the Old World, was discovered beneath the riverbed, the bizarre actions of the 19th century engineers suddenly make perfect logistical sense. Their monumental effort wasn't excavation, it was refurbishment. The 38 million bricks were not used to build a new tunnel, but to line, reinforce, and hide the ancient, anomalous structure they found. The massive water pumps were required to drain a flooded, forgotten ruin, not a fresh dig. And most importantly, it explains the terminal flaw. The original ancient architects of this tube never intended for primitive, coal-burning steam engines to pass through it. The Victorian engineers tried to force their crude, smoky 19th century technology into a legacy infrastructure designed for something entirely different, and the physics of the environment violently rejected it. The history books claim the Mersey Tunnel was a triumph of Victorian digging, but a forensic audit of the math, the mass, and the toxic air suggests it was the most expensive, poorly planned repurposing project in the history of the British Empire. The bricks are Victorian, but the void they hide belongs to a ledger they erased. But if you think moving 400,000 tons of wet rock beneath a British river was the ultimate defiance of physics, you haven't looked at the mud of Manhattan.
Just a few years later, an American syndicate claimed to execute a completely different kind of subterranean slaughter. They claimed to excavate 3 million tons of earth directly beneath the most congested, heavily populated city on Earth, and they supposedly did it while keeping the skyscrapers above from collapsing into the void. The forensic audit of the New York subway's 3 million ton cover-up is opening on your screen right now. The ledger remains open.